Chapter 4. Botanica Santa Marto, DeBota. Falco left the hospital unescorted. He crossed the street and walked into the liquor store. Bottle of rum from somewhere below the top shelf. The short, stocky man with a bright red nose behind the counter slid the bottle into a plain brown paper bag. As Falco paid for it, the said hair of the dog as he handed the package over and winked. He left the small shop and turned right, going further down the hill. He walked into an upmarket cigar store and purchased 3 mid-range cigars and turned and walked back up the hill. He felt a little winded when he reached the top of Albright St and walked under the train trestle to the proverbial and literal wrong side of the tracks. Falco thought he needed to start going to the gym again and stop smoking and maybe drink less. Hell, while he was at it, he should go back to school and become a lawyer. Going down the hill was easier, and he shelved the internal debate on self-improvement for now. Straight up Albright, where it ended at a little park dedicated to Colonel Donovan. On the left, just before the park, was looking up at a bright red canopy that ran the length of the building. It read Botanica Santa Marto. He looked in the front window. It was full of palms, plants, candles, and posters and statues of the Holy Mother, statues of Jesus, and enough candles to burn bright from now till Judgment Day. He entered the small shop and the bell over the door chimed, and eminently he was assailed by the smoke and smell of herbs and medicinal concoctions that was overwhelming to the senses. He had just about recovered from the smell when a small Hispanic woman of indeterminate age appeared from waving some burning white sticks behind him and spitting at his feet. She waved the smoke everywhere between his back and the door, yelling and screaming at unseen threats that she always insisted that were always just a step behind him. For a long time he had thought that everyone who walked in the shop received this treatment as some sales tactic. It was somewhat of a shock that this wasn't the case. He was a special case. After all the spitting and a mild case of smoke inhalation, the woman pulled him down into a hug and kissed him on both cheeks. He smiled at her and quickly deflected her numerous questions about his well-being. Falco looked at her with pleading eyes, saying, "Mama, I need your help." Still holding his hand, she pulled back and looked at him, asking what kind of help you need. She made a gesture with her finger closes together as if asking if it was a little favor. He shook his head as to indicate the negative. She tilted her head to the other side, asking, "Muy grand." He shook his head, and his bad Spanish he said, "Mucho más grand." She sighed heavily and then nodded as if she had come to a decision, looked up at him and then touched his cheek fondly. She pulled him through the store past free-standing shrines, water features, candles, and figurines depicting every imaginable biblical character. Even deeper to where she mixed up her foul-smelling folk remedies, and she yelled at a teenaged boy in rapid-fire Spanish who was doing something on his cell phone. She reached over and knocked his feet off the counter as she passed. She brought Falco into the back room and closed the door to the small, what could be loosely called an office. There was a well-used sofa that still seemed comfortable and shelves full of uncountable oddities. Things in jars of thick liquids of many different colors. Other things pressed between glass. Other things that seemed to still be alive, and some larger creatures in small cages and tanks. He walked over to a large cage that was covered in thick black sackcloth and started to pull up the corn. There was a hiss and he got his hand slapped. Mama was standing there next to him with her index finger raised, saying, "No, no tokes." He held out the gifts that he had picked up on his walk up the hill. She smiled as she opened the bags and looked in at the contents. Tricked out a cigar and bit the end off and spit it into a large glass and metal ashtray with what looked like a hand of a small monkey coming out of the middle of it. She took out a box of wooden matches and then Falco said, "Uncle Mike is in the hospital." Mama hesitated for a moment and then she opened the box and asked what happened to him. Falco took a deep breath and said it was a Murnock. Mama was in the middle of striking a match when he said that. And the box went flying, sending hundreds of wooden matches scattering across the old wooden desk. Falco took the box half that was still in her shaking hand and picked up a match off the desk and lit it on the box. The end of the cigar was swinging back and forth so much that he had to steady her hand to get the end burning. She sat back in the large wooden leather chair, running her arms through 2 heavy leather straps that were attached to the chair, running them up to her shoulders. She seemed to almost disappear in the dark room. If it wasn't for the large glow of the cigar, he would have thought that she was gone. The silence lingered as the dark room filled up with smoke. She spoke hesitantly, "You are sure?" Falco went over to the chair that sat in the light that came through the small window up above Mama's head. He looked at the red glow and only nodded. The glow came again. She asked in a shaky voice, "Are you sure he was the one it wanted?" Falco shrugged and stood up and took the bottle of rum out of its bag. He opened the top drawer closest to him and took out 2 glasses of dubious cleanliness, placed them on the desk and began to pour. He watched as they were filled to the rim. The intermittent red glow from the recesses of the chair continued, so he filled it up to just below the rim of each glass. The hand that came out of the shadow seemed almost skeletal, much more so than it had looked just moments before. The leather restraints strained and the stretching of leather was audible. There was an eerie squeaking of the wheels of the big chair. The chair moved forward inches and her face was just on the edges of the shadows. It was bathed in deep shadows that seemed to flow downward like a dark mist, not hiding the shape but lending shape to the emptiness. The shape it revealed was hideous. The seeming voids where eyes should have been seemed to draw the shadows that passed deep into them. The hand stretched out and grabbed the glass, then retreated back into darkness. That hand. The feeling that Falco felt when he heard the voice was even more incomprehensible, deeper and more distant. The glow always appeared in the same location, but that voice felt as if it was echoing off the damp walls of a distant cave hundreds of years ago and thousands of miles away. Clouds must have passes because the room went very dark. Sangre, the voice came out of the shadow sounding like it came from a mouth drier than parchment. Then the deep disgusting gurgle sucked and lapped it made as the rum was imbibed was inhuman. He ignored the scream for sangre, the Spanish word for blood. Mama had told him that when she spoke from the world of the dead it was a struggle between life and death. It was always a difficult fight, but if they were ever given blood it would give them a foothold in this world. Even the blood of a dead animal would give them incredible strength. Blood of a living animal even more so. But if it was human blood alive of dead would be so much worse. The blood of a dead person above ground gives them a firm anchor to the core. I think you could imagine where that could lead. Think Night of the Living Dead. If they have the blood of a living, breathing person. Well, did you ever see Exorcist? It screamed and hissed the one word again, sangre, and Falco moved away from where he believed the chair to be, walking around the desk and sitting in one of the chairs that were there. The silence grew, punctuated by the lapping at the empty glass and the glow of the cigar. The smoke had filled the ceiling like water and was pulling just above their heads. Falco just sat looking into the darkness, waiting. Heard the squeak of the chair and was up like a shot. He grabbed the other glass and pulled back just before that hand flew out of the shadows again, just missing it as he pulled back. He sat on the desk and took a small sip of the rum as the voice shrieked in a rage. There was another squeak of the wheels of the chair and Falco ducked just as the other glass flew from the shadows. He held the rum just out of reach in the light and the creams became cries and entered a full-blown, unearthly tantrum. He just swirled the dark liquid around in the glass and watched it shimmer in the light, just regarding it thoughtfully. As he brought it to his lips, the raspy voice echoed out, "Una daga en el corazón, debajo de los dos árboles pequeños." He moved the glass down in the direction of the table and could hear the sound of the leather straps straining again. The skeletal hand was reaching into the dim light that was coming from the dingy window. Falco stood like a statue, holding just a few inches beyond the reach. That voice cried out again in a scream of anguish that made him wince. It went of what, a minute of 3, but to Falco it felt like so much longer. Then she cried out in a deep scream. El sol negro brillará hasta que se rompan 7 piedras de sangre. El sol negro continuará brillando hasta que se hayan aplastado 7 piedras de sangre o se haya lavado la sombra oscura con luz. With his root street Spanish, he could not make out much of what that unearthly voice was saying. He relied on mostly an instinct when doing this, however Mama's trust in him made it easier to deal with what was a great respect. He had only done this on 3 other occasions, but this time the atmosphere of the event was much darker, more sinister. The change was much more visible. Any apprehensions he harbored that this was an act were fading quickly. Hand was still reaching when the yell started again. The large heavy desk must have been kicked or moved by some other force. It flew up in the air and came down with him still on it. He managed to keep most of the rum in the large glass. This could be contributed to a few years' practice being fell down drunk. He continued to project a sense of calm, like none of this was affecting him in any way. The hand returned to the shadows. The cries and hisses subsided. The only sound was the raspy breath and the hiss-like exhalation. An intermittent glow of the cigar was punctuated by enormous clouds of smoke that filled the air and blew past Falco like a jet out of a firehouse. He just sat on the desk swirling the rum in a glass. Then after a final cry of frustration the deep voice came again. It was cold, distant and raspy still, only with all the similarities, it was still much different. Between blinding screens of smoke, The voice spoke in a rapid-fire burst that was not English or Spanish or any language that he was versed in but somehow felt familiar. The words felt meaningless but the meaning of the words seemed clear, only the word came so fast that it was like a slideshow in his head. Just an endless stream of disjointed images that lacked the anchor of context or any connection to reality. This intangible monologue was passing by him and it seemed to have never begun and never ended. Every image in his head lingered and disappeared like a mist in the sun. It could have been 5 minutes or 3 years in this state. Time had become a meaningless, intangible idea. When the voice finally went silent, Falco put the glass down on the desk and fell back into the chair. The glass was picked up and drank with a ferocity and hunger that no living creature could have attained. To Falco, that noise was still part of that time without time, and every sound was his to savor in his head over and over again. A deep growl seemed to come from every direction and was focused directly at his gut. The sound started to fade just as glass was placed on the desk upside down and the light that came from the window seemed to return. Falco wanted to scream. His brain felt like it was just flattened run from one reel of film editor, having frames cut into his memories and then left in a pile on the floor. Then the pile was slowly congealing into his head on frame at a time. He sat nearly motionless, not counting that feeling that every muscle in his body was twitching so quickly that it gave the illusion of being frozen. Every part of his body felt as if it was slowly being reconnected to his brain by a system of trial and error. Falco registered someone entering the room and in his peripheral vision saw that the teenage boy was in the room standing by Mama's side. Everything that happened around him was happening in jerky stop motion. Falco could feel his body slowly coming under his control again. Trying to move the fingers on his left hand made the front of his right shoe move. Then when he tried to wiggle his toes, his eyes started to blink. It was like being in the body of some strange creature made up of spare parts. Soon Mama and the young boy were standing next to him. She was holding a damp white washcloth to his nose. He seemed to feel it somewhere on his lower back, but Mama's soft words calmed him. Her voice was part lullaby and part mantra. He could feel his body slowly coming into focus. The parts that felt like they were connected by tenuous telegraph lines were pulled back to the center and found a vague connection, regaining some lever of dexterity. Falco could see the washcloth was now entirely a uniformed bright pink. Mama tried to put the washcloth in his hand and have him hold it to his nose. His arm fell away uselessly. The chanting went on and she rubbed his head in a maternal and proprietary manner, chanting the whole time. He felt it when control of his lungs returned. He was at a quick pant. So, he focused on slowing his breathing to a normal rhythm. It took a few minutes, but it came. Then trying to look around the room brought a pain to his head that made him want to curl up in a little ball and cry softly to himself. Sometime much later he managed to sit up straight, leaning against the desk with his ass feeling the cold of the cement floor regardless of the thick rug he was now sitting on. Falco was finally able to hold the washcloth up by himself. It felt like it weighed 20 pounds. His ears were still ringing so he could barely hear Mama when she was talking. He could not hear her words too. He looked at her lips. It looked like she was played a guitar. He looked around and there was no guitar. He tried again. She made the sound slower, para de guitar. He said, "I'm not screaming." The words came out slurred and slow, but the deafening sound was suddenly gone and he could hear again.